Imagine being so feared by your enemy that they issue written orders to their entire army never to engage you in combat, not out of respect, not out of honor, but because fighting you is considered a guaranteed tactical disaster. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian SAS soldiers earned something unprecedented in modern warfare, an institutional fear so profound that the North Vietnamese Army, one of the most disciplined and effective fighting forces of the 20th century, told their troops to run rather than fight. This is the story of how a small group of soldiers became ghosts that haunted the jungles of Vietnam. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, April 19. The air hung thick with humidity as Sergeant Jack Morrison adjusted his grip on the modified L1A1 rifle. Around him, 3 other shadows moved through the jungle canopy with practiced silence. Ghost, as his team called him, had earned the nickname not through bravado but through results. In 12 weeks of operations, his 4-man patrol had eliminated over 40 enemy combatants without losing a single team member. But tonight was different. Tonight, they were hunting something bigger. Intelligence reports indicated a North Vietnamese Army Battalion command post had been established somewhere in the dense forest ahead. Unlike the Viet Cong guerrillas who dominated most of the fighting, the NVA were professionals, regular army, well-trained, well-equipped, and operating under sophisticated command structures that rivaled anything the West could field. Finding them would be difficult. Eliminating them without getting his team killed would be nearly impossible. Corporal David Chen raised his fist, the universal signal for freeze. Morrison dropped to a crouch, every sense heightened. Chen was the best tracker in the regiment, capable of reading disturbances in the jungle that others would miss entirely. The son of Chinese-Australian immigrants, Chen had faced skepticism early in his career. Some officers questioned whether someone of Asian descent could be trusted in an Asian war. Chen had answered those questions by becoming indispensable. Morrison crawled forward until he was beside Chen. The corporal pointed to barely visible boot print in the soft earth, then to broken vegetation along a narrow trail. Fresh, very fresh. Morrison nodded and signaled the team to follow at tactical spacing. They moved like water through the undergrowth, each step deliberate and silent. 300 meters ahead, Major Nguyen Van Thieu sat at a folding table covered in maps and radio. As the senior intelligence officer for the 274th Regiment, Thieu had spent the past 6 months analyzing after-action reports from units operating in Phuoc Tuy Province. The pattern disturbed him. Small Australian patrols, rarely more than 6 men, were achieving results that seemed statistically impossible. Ambushes that killed 15 or 20 NVA soldiers without Australian casualties. Supply convoys destroyed by forces that melted into the jungle before reinforcements could arrive. Officers assassinated with precision that suggested advance intelligence. Lieutenant Pham Duc Minh entered the command post and saluted. At 28, Pham commanded a company of 120 men, veterans of campaigns stretching back to the French colonial era. He was confident, perhaps overly so, and tonight that confidence was about to be tested. Major Thieu, reporting as ordered, Pham said. Sit, Lieutenant. Thieu gestured to a camp stool. I want to discuss your patrol sectors for the coming week. Pham leaned over the map, studying the marked zones. My company can cover these areas effectively. We have encountered minimal resistance. The southern approaches seem particularly quiet. Thieu frowned. That concerns me more than it should comfort you. Our radio intercepts suggest Australian SS activity in precisely those quiet zones. They do not occupy ground, Lieutenant. They haunt it. Pham suppressed a smile. With respect, Major, we have faced Americans, South Vietnamese Rangers, and Korean Marines. I have confidence my men can handle a few Australians. Thieu studied the younger officer for a long moment. That confidence may get your men killed, Lieutenant. The Australians fight differently. They do not seek to hold territory. They seek to kill you and disappear before you can respond. And they are disturbingly effective. Back in the jungle, Morrison's team had found what they were looking for. Through his binoculars, Ghost could see the command post clearly. 20 soldiers visible, probably more in the surrounding defensive positions. Radio antennas, maps, officers. This was definitely a command element. He signaled Chen to mark the coordinates while he calculated fields of fire and egress routes. The smart play was to call in artillery. They were well within range of Australian guns at Nui Dat base, but Morrison knew that artillery strikes on jungle targets were unreliable. Too much canopy, too many places to take cover. Better to get closer, better to make it personal. He signaled his plan to the team using hand gestures. 2 men would provide overwatch and covering fire. Morrison and Chen would move within 50 meters, and engage the command group directly. When the NVA reacted, they would break contact and extract along pre-planned routes. Simple, brutal, effective. 15 minutes later, they were in position. Morrison could hear voices speaking Vietnamese, calm and professional. Officers discussing coordinates and patrol schedule. He selected his first target, a major sitting at the table with his back exposed. Through the rifle scope, Morrison could see the man's rank insignia clearly. High-value target. He squeezed the trigger. The suppressed rifle made a sound like a branch breaking. The major jerked forward, dead before his body hit the dirt. Morrison shifted aim and fired twice more. 2 soldiers fell. Chen's rifle joined the symphony of controlled violence. In 8 seconds, 6 men were down. Then the jungle exploded. NVA soldiers scattered for cover, returning fire wildly in the direction they thought the shots had come from. But Morrison and Chen were already moving, low and fast, using terrain and vegetation to mask their withdrawal. Behind them, the 2 Overwatch operators fired carefully aimed shots, creating the illusion of a larger force attacking from multiple directions. Pham Duc Minh hit the ground as bullets snapped overhead. He had been 50 meters from the command post when the shooting started. Rolling behind a tree, he tried to assess the situation. The firing was coming from at least 2 directions. How many attackers? Where was the main assault coming? He shouted orders to his platoon commanders, organizing a counterattack. But when his soldiers advanced into the jungle where the shots had originated, they found nothing. No bodies, no blood trails, no equipment, just empty forest and the distant sound of movement disappearing into the darkness. Major Thieu was dead. So were 5 other soldiers, including 2 lieutenants. The command post was in chaos. Radio equipment had been damaged in the firefight. Maps were scattered, and the attackers had vanished like smoke. Pham stared into the jungle, his earlier confidence replaced by cold realization. This was not normal combat. This was something else entirely. 2 weeks later, Pham sat in a briefing room at the 274th Regiment headquarters. Around him, a dozen other company commanders listened as the new intelligence officer, Captain Le Van Dong, presented findings that would change NVA operational doctrine. Comrades, Captain Le began, we have analyzed 73 separate engagements involving Australian forces over the past 8 months. The casualty ratio is unprecedented. For every Australian killed or wounded, we have lost an average of 14 soldiers. This is unsustainable. He displayed a map covered with colored pins. Each red pin represents an engagement where Australian SAS was positively identified. Notice the pattern. They operate in small teams, rarely more than 6 men. They avoid fortified positions. They target command elements, supply lines, and isolate patrols. And most significantly, they almost never allow themselves to be fixed in place long enough for us to bring superior numbers to bear. Pham raised his hand. Captain, what do you recommend? We cannot simply concede territory to forces. Le looked at him gravely. We are not conceding territory. We are choosing not to die pointlessly. Effective immediately. All units operating in areas with known or suspected Australian presence will follow new standing orders. If you identify Australian forces, you are not to engage. You are to report their position via radio, mark coordinates as precisely as possible, and withdraw to a safe distance while maintaining observation if tactically feasible. The room erupted in murmurs. Several officers looked uncomfortable. This ran counter to every instinct trained into them. Lay raised his. This is not cowardice, comrades. This is tactical necessity. Australian SAS patrols rarely operate in isolation. They have immediate access to artillery support, airstrikes, and rapid reaction infantry. Engaging a 6-man SAS patrol often means calling down fire support that will destroy an entire company. Furthermore, the Australians are experts at ambush. What appears to be an isolated patrol is frequently bait designed to lure you into a prepared kill zone. He clicked to the next slide, showing captured documents. These are Australian after-action we recovered from a downed helicopter. Read them carefully. They describe ambush doctrine in explicit detail. The SAS uses itself as bait. They allow themselves to be detected, then lead pursuers into overlapping fields of fire supported by machine guns and mortars. By the time you realize you are in the kill zone, it's too late. Sergeant Tran Hong Son, a veteran scout with 8 years of jungle warfare experience, had seen the new orders with skepticism. He had survived the French War, the early American escalation, and countless firefights. The idea of running from a handful of foreigners seemed absurd. But Tran was also a professional, and professionals learned from experience. That experience came 3 weeks later during a routine patrol near the Courtenay rubber plant. Tran was leading 5 men through terrain they had traversed dozens of times before. They were moving carefully, but not expecting contact. This area had been quiet for months. Then Tran saw something that made his blood freeze. Boot prints. Not the cheap sandals worn by Viet Cong guerrillas or even standard NVA issue boots. These were distinctive, with a tread pattern he had learned to recognize in Australian jungle boots. He raised his fist, and his patrol froze instantly. Tran examined the ground carefully. The prints were fresh, less than 2 hours old. 4 men, moving tactically with proper spacing, heading northeast toward the main supply route. This was a reconnaissance patrol, probably looking for convoy targets. Tran's instinct was to follow, to hunt the hunter. His men were experienced. They had the numerical advantage. But the standing orders were clear, and Tran had read enough after-action reports to know those orders existed for good reason. He signaled his radio man forward and called in the contact report. Australian patrol, 4 men, heading northeast from these coordinates. We are breaking contact and moving west to observation position. The radio man looked confused. Sergeant, we outnumber them. We could engage. Tran shook his head. And then what? We kill 1 or 2 before they call in artillery? Before their support element moves in? I have seen what happens to units that engage Australians without preparation. I will not lead you into that death trap. We follow orders. We observe and report. As his patrol moved away from the Australian tracks, Tran felt frustration mixed with grudging respect. The enemy had turned the jungle into their personal hunting, and the NVA, for all their training and experience, had learned that some prey was too dangerous. Back at Nui Dat Base, Private Tom Richardson watched as Morrison's patrol debriefed with intelligence officers. Bluey, as everyone called the red-haired infantryman, had been assigned to provide security during the debrief, which meant he got to listen to Ghost and his team describe their latest operation. So you are telling me, the intelligence captain, that you walked to within 50 meters of an NVA company, killed 6, including a major, and extracted without casualties or even contact? Morrison nodded tiredly. That is correct, sir. The NVA responded quickly, but their fire discipline broke down. They were shooting at shadows. By the time they organized a proper search, we were 800 meters away moving to the extraction point. The captain made notes. This is the 4th time this month we have seen reduced NVA aggression after initial contact with SAS patrols. They are definitely changing their tactics. Instead of pursuing or counterattacking, they seem to be withdrawing and calling for reinforcements that never catch up to you. Chen spoke up. We intercepted radio traffic during the extractions. We do not have full translation yet, but the tone was interesting. Not aggressive or angry, more like worried. They kept repeating coordinates and requesting permission to disengage. Permission to disengage, the captain. That is unusual phrasing. It suggests they wanted to break contact but needed authorization. As if not pursuing was against their standard procedure, but they were seeking permission to do it anyway. Richardson listened with growing amazement. He had been in Vietnam for 6 months, participating in search and destroy operations with his infantry battalion. Those operations involved hundreds of soldiers sweeping through territory, usually making contact with enemy forces that melted away or fought briefly or retreating. Casualties were steady on both sides, but the SAS seemed to be operating in a completely different war, a war where 4 men could terrorize an entire enemy regiment. Later that evening, Richardson approached Morrison at the mess tent. Sergeant, can I ask you something? Morrison looked up from his... What is on your mind, Bluey? How do you do it? 4 blokes going into the bush against hundreds of NVA. How do you not get killed? Morrison considered the question. Training helps. We spend months learning to move silently, to shoot accurately under stress, to navigate by dead reckoning. But the real secret is not fighting fair, Bluey. We do not engage on the enemy's terms. We choose the time, the place, and the target. We hit them when they are not expecting it, from directions they are not watching. And most importantly, we leave before they can organize a response. But what if they do catch you? What if you cannot get away? Then we call in every bit of fire support we can and turn the jungle into hell on earth while we extract. Artillery, mortars, airstrikes, whatever it. The NVA learned that chasing us usually means dying in large numbers. That is why they are starting to just let us go. It is not worth the casualty. Richardson shook his head in wonder. Back in Raleigh Company, if we take contact, we fix the enemy and call in reinforcements. Big hammer tactics, overwhelming force. But you lot do the opposite. You are the reinforcements getting called in. Morrison smiled slightly. Different tool for different job, mate. Your infantry holds ground and shows the flag. We make sure the enemy is too busy looking over their shoulder to cause trouble. Both jobs matter. Ours just happens to make the news less often. In Hanoi, General Vo Nguyen Giap reviewed reports from the Southern Command with growing concern. The legendary commander who had defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu was now grappling with an unexpected problem. Australian forces, though numerically small, were having an outsized impact on NVA operations in their assigned provinces. An aide placed another folder on his desk. General, additional casualty reports from Phuoc Tuy province. 12 officers killed in the past month. 15 supply convoys ambushed. The 274th Regiment is requesting permission to withdraw units from forward positions to reduce exposure. Giap lit a cigarette and studied the map. The Australians are fighting a different kind of war. They are not trying to hold territory. They are trying to make it too expensive for us to operate. Attrition through precision rather than mass. The aide hesitated. General, some commanders are questioning the standing orders regarding Australian SAS units. They feel it damages morale to order retreats from such small forces. Giap slammed his hand on the desk. Damaged morale is preferable to destroyed companies. I have read the after-action report. I have seen what happens when our troops engage Australian patrols without proper preparation. The casualty ratios are unacceptable. We are losing experienced officers and NCOs we cannot easily replace. The standing orders remain in effect. If commanders do not like it, they can explain their alternative strategy for avoiding those casualties. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. The Americans fight with overwhelming force and firepower. They are predictable. They move in large formations. They establish fire bases. They operate with logistical tails that stretch for kilometers. We have learned to counter that. But the Australians, they fight more like us. Small units, independent operations, emphasis on stealth and surprise. That makes them far more dangerous in the terrain we control. The aide made notes. Should we assign specialized units to hunt Australian patrols specifically? Giap shook his head. That is exactly what they want. They excel at ambush warfare. Sending hunters after them just provides more targets. No, we contain them through avoidance and intelligence. We track their movements, we report their positions, and we route our own operations around them when possible. It is frustrating, but it keeps our casualties manageable. The Americans will not stay in Vietnam forever. Eventually they will leave, and the Australians will leave with them. Until then, we minimize our losses and maintain our strength for the larger struggle. Back in Phuoc Tuy province, Pham Duc Minh had learned his lesson well. 4 months after the attack that killed Major Thieu, Pham now commanded a full battalion. He had survived through caution and adherence to the new tactical doctrine. When scouts reported Australian presence, he routed patrols around them. When engagements were unavoidable, he used overwhelming force with prepared withdrawal routes. But tonight presented a dilemma. His scouts had located an Australian patrol, setting up what appeared to be an ambush position along a trail his battalion needed to use. The Australians were only 4 men. His battalion was 400. The tactical advantage seemed overwhelming. But Pham remembered the command post attack, the bodies, the chaos. He remembered Major Thieu's warning that the Australians fought differently. He called his senior sergeant, Tran Hong Son, to his position. Sergeant, what do you think? Can we neutralize this patrol without triggering their support elements? Tran studied the terrain through binoculars. Comrade Lieutenant, I think this is exactly what they want us to attempt. Look at the position. They are in a slight depression with good cover, but it is also a natural approach route for anyone wanting to attack them. The high ground behind them is perfect for supporting machine guns or mortars. I suspect this is bait. Pham felt the familiar frustration. So we just avoid them? Allow 4 men to dictate our movement? Tran lowered the binoculars. Comrade Lieutenant, in the past year, I have seen what happens to units that engage Australian SAS without proper preparation. I have helped carry the bodies. I have listened to the wounded describe how a small ambush became an artillery match. Yes, it is frustrating. Yes, it feels like cowardice. But staying alive to fight tomorrow is not cowardice. It is tactics. Pham made his decision. We will route the battalion north along the secondary trail. It adds 2 hours to our march, but it keeps us away from this ambush. Inform company commanders. Silent movement protocols in effect. We will avoid contact. As the NVA battalion melted into the jungle, Morrison watched through his rifle scope with mixed feelings. He had spent 6 hours setting up this ambush position. The trail below was a known NVA route. By all logic, enemy forces should have walked right into his kill zone, but they had not come. Either their intelligence was better than expected, or they were deliberately avoiding Australian positions. Chen moved up beside him. They are not taking the bait anymore, Ghost. They have learned. Morrison nodded slowly. That is both good and bad. Good because it means we are effective enough that they changed their entire tactical doctrine. Bad because it means future operation will be harder. An enemy that learns is more dangerous than one that just throws bodies at. They extracted from the position as dawn approached, moving through the jungle with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times. Back at base, the debrief was brief. No contact. Possible enemy avoidance of ambush. Recommend continued operations to maintain pressure. But Morrison knew something had shifted. The NVA were no longer fighting Australian SAS patrols. They were avoiding them. That represented a strange kind of victory, not through killing, but through fear, through reputation, through the knowledge that engaging Australians was too costly to be worthwhile. In the months that followed, the pattern solidified. North Vietnamese Army units operating in areas with Australian presence received explicit standing orders that were eventually captured by Allied forces. The documents were remarkable for their candor. Do not engage Australian patrols unless you have overwhelming numerical superiority and prepared support. Prioritize reporting Australian positions to higher command over initiating combat. Australian forces are equipped with immediate fire support, including artillery and airstrikes. Engaging small Australian patrols typically results in disproportionate casualties. When possible, avoid areas of known Australian operation. These orders were not the result of isolated incidents, but of systematic analysis by NVA intelligence officers who recognized that traditional tactics were ineffective against Australian SAS doctrine. The NVA was a professional military force that learned from experience and adapted accordingly. The adaptation in this case was tactical avoidance. Sergeant Chen found himself in an unexpected position by early 1970. As one of the most experienced SAS operators in theater, he was pulled from patrol duty to help train new arrivals. Standing before a group of fresh-faced soldiers just arrived from Australia, he felt the weight of experience in every word. Gentlemen, you are about to enter a unique situation in military history. The enemy is afraid of you before you ever meet them. They have standing orders to avoid contact with Australian patrols. That does not mean they will not fight if cornered. It does not mean they are incompetent. It means they have learned, through painful experience, that fighting us on our terms is a losing proposition. One of the new soldiers raised his hand. Corporal, does not that make our job easy? If they are avoiding us, how do we make contact? Chen smiled. That is the paradox. We have become so effective that the enemy's primary tactic is simply not being where we are. But our mission has not changed. We still need to disrupt their operations, gather intelligence, and eliminate high-value targets. That means we have to be smarter, more patient, and more precise than ever before. The easy targets are gone. What remains are the disciplined units that follow orders and the desperate ones that have no choice to fight. He pulled out a map. The NVA control large sections of this province through guerrilla infrastructure and intimidation. They cannot abandon that infrastructure just because we are here. So they work around us. They change routes. They move at different times. They use alternative supply methods. Our job is to understand those patterns and position ourselves not where the enemy is, but where they will be. That requires thinking several moves ahead. Another soldier spoke up. Corporal, is it true that NVA officers get commended for avoiding contact with us rather than engaging? Chen nodded. Intelligence intercepts suggest exactly that. In most armies, withdrawal without engaging would be considered cowardice or dereliction of duty. But the NVA has made a calculated decision that preserving force strength is more important than tactical pride. They know we are not here permanently. They know the Americans will eventually leave, and we will leave with them. So their strategy is to outlast us while minimizing casualties. It is frustrating, but it is also militarily sound. Back in the bush, Morrison was on what would be his final patrol before rotation back to Australia. 12 months of operation, 42 confirmed enemy killed, 0 friendly casualties, immediate patrol. The numbers spoke for themselves, but Ghost knew that statistics only told part of the story. The real impact was not measured in body count, but in enemy behavior. NVA units that once moved freely through Phuoc Tuy province now crept through the jungle, terrified of stumbling into Australian ambushes. Supply routes had been abandoned or heavily modified. Officer casualties had disrupted command structures. The presence of a few hundred Australian soldiers had changed the calculus for thousands of enemy troops. As his patrol moved through the pre-dawn darkness, Morrison reflected on what they had accomplished. They had not won the war. Vietnam would continue long after he went home, but they had created a bubble of relative security in their operational area. They had protected Australian bases, disrupted enemy logistics, and most importantly, They had survived while making the enemy pay heavily for every mistake. Chen moved up beside him, hand raised in the stop signal. Morrison froze instant. His scout pointed to fresh tracks crossing their path. NVA, at least a platoon, moving fast. Recent, probably within the hour. Morrison signaled the patrol into a defensive position while he considered options. They could follow the tracks, potentially making contact. They could call in the sighting and let another unit handle it, or they could continue their mission and avoid entanglement. A year ago, he would have pursued immediately. But now, near the end of his tour, Morrison found himself thinking more carefully about risk versus reward. He made the call, report the tracks, and continue. They were not here to chase every enemy patrol. They were here to complete their assigned reconnaissance objective. That kind of discipline, that ability to let targets pass when the tactical situation was not favorable, was what separated professional soldiers from glory seekers. As they moved past the enemy tracks, Morrison wondered if the NVA platoon even knew how close they had come to an Australian patrol. Probably not, and that was fine. The best operations were the ones where you completed your mission without firing a shot. Despite what movies suggested, combat was a failure of planning, not a goal to. Lieutenant Pham, now a captain commanding a full regiment, stood before his officers in late 1971. The war had changed significantly. He had first encountered Australian forces 5 years earlier. American units were withdrawing. The political situation was shifting. But the Australian task force remained operationally active, and their SAS patrols continued to be a persistent problem. Comrades, Pham began, I want to share lessons learned from 5 years of operations in the Australian area of operations. Some of you are recently transferred and may not fully understand why we have the standing orders regarding Australian forces. Allow me to provide context. He gestured to a chart showing casualties. When we engage Australian SAS patrols without proper preparation, we lose an average of 14 soldiers for every enemy casualty inflict. When we follow doctrine and avoid direct engagement, choosing instead to report and reposition, our casualties in those sectors drop by over 70%. This is not theory. This is mathematical reality based on 5 years. An officer raised his hand. Comrade Captain, what about morale? Do these avoidance orders not impact fighting spirit? Pham had expected this question. He had asked it himself years earlier. Fighting spirit is preserved by winning battles and surviving to fight again. Throwing soldiers into combat situations where they have minimal chance of success does not build morale. It destroys experienced units and creates. By contrast, following tactical doctrine that minimizes casualties while maintaining operational effectiveness builds confidence. Our soldiers know that when we engage the enemy, we do so from positions of advantage. That knowledge is worth more than false bravado. He pulled out a captured Australian document. This is an after-action report from an Australian SAS patrol. Listen to what it says. Patrol observed enemy forces approximately 40 strong, moving along trail coordinate X. Did not engage due to risk of becoming decisively engaged before extraction could be effected. Reported position to higher command for artillery or airstrike. Notice what happened here. The Australians, despite having surprise and superior position, chose not to engage because they calculated the risk was too high. They are not supermen. They are professionals who understand tactical restraint. We should learn from that rather than resent it. The meeting concluded with Pham feeling cautiously optimistic. The younger officers seemed to understand. The institutional knowledge about Australian tactics was now embedded in NVA doctrine. Whatever happened in the larger war, this particular lesson had been learned at high cost and would not be forgotten. By 1972, Australian forces were being withdrawn from Vietnam. The political decision had been made. The war would continue without them. Morrison, now a sergeant major training new SAS recruits in Australia, found himself reflecting on his service with mixed emotions. They had done their job with professional excellence. The casualty ratios spoke for themselves. They had achieved tactical dominance in their area of operation. But the larger strategic picture remained unchanged. North Vietnam would eventually win the war. South Vietnam would fall. All the skill and bravery of individual soldiers could not overcome political and strategic realities. But Morrison also knew that what they had accomplished mattered on its own terms. They had protected Australian bases and personnel. They had prevented enemy operations in their sectors. They had demonstrated that small, highly trained units could achieve disproportionate impact through superior tactics and training. And perhaps most importantly, they had earned respect from their enemies. Not affection, not friendship, but the professional recognition that fighting Australians was costly and dangerous. In later years, after the war ended and Vietnam was unified under Northern control, researchers would discover extensive NVA documentation about Australian forces, training manual, after-action reviews, casualty analyses, standing orders, all of it confirming what had been rumored during the war. The North Vietnamese Army had issued institutional guidance to avoid engaging Australian SAS when possible because the casualty ratio was unsustainable. That documentation represented something unusual in military history. Modern armies rarely admit in writing that they fear specific enemy units. But the NVA was a professional force that valued tactical effectiveness over pride. If avoiding Australian patrols saved lives and maintained operational capability, then avoidance became doctrine. Simple, pragmatic, effective. Chen, who stayed in the military after Vietnam and eventually reached senior rank, was interviewed decades later about his experiences. The interviewer asked the obvious question, "How did it feel knowing the enemy was afraid of you?" Chen considered his response carefully. "It felt like we were doing our job correctly. Fear was not the goal. Tactical effectiveness was the goal. But fear was a useful byproduct. An enemy that is afraid makes mistakes. An enemy that avoids you leaves operational space. We use that space to accomplish our missions with minimal casualty. That is what success looks like in unconventional warfare." "But did you ever respect your enemy?" the interviewer pressed. Chen nodded slowly. "Absolutely." The NVA was a formidable opponent. Disciplined, experienced, tactically adaptive. They learned from their mistakes and changed their doctrine accordingly. The standing orders to avoid engaging us were not cowardice. They were smart tactics. If I had been in their position, I would have issued the same orders. Why fight battles you are likely to lose when you can accomplish your strategic objectives through other means? We respected them as professionals. That respect made us better soldiers. Tran Hong Son survived the war and eventually wrote a memoir that was published in Vietnam in the 1990s. One chapter focused specifically on his experiences with Australian forces. The translation found its way to Australian military historians, who found his perspective fascinating. "We called them ghosts," Tran wrote, "not because they were invisible, but because they moved through the jungle like spirits. You would find their tracks, but never see them. You would hear shots and find bodies, but the shoot would be gone. We learned quickly that chasing them was futile and dangerous. They wanted you to chase them. They wanted you to become angry and careless. So we learned discipline. We learned to report and withdraw. We learned that survival was more important than pride. Some of my comrades thought this made us cowards, but I saw it differently. The Australians had forced us to evolve our tactics. They had made us better soldiers by punishing our mistakes so severely. That is the mark of a dangerous enemy. Not one who kills many, but one who forces you to change everything about how you fight just to survive. If I had one message for those Australian soldiers, it would be this: you were worthy opponents. You fought with skill and professionalism. You made us afraid, yes, but you also made us respect you. That is a rare thing in war." Private Richardson, who served his full tour and returned home to Australia, found himself giving talks at schools about his experiences. Students always ask the same question. Did you kill anyone? Were you scared? What was it like? But the question that stuck with him most came from a 10-year-old boy. Did the enemy think you were the good guys? Richardson had struggled to answer. "I do not think they thought of us he finally said. They thought of us as dangerous, as threats to be avoided. War is not really about good guys and bad guys when you are actually in it. It is about survival and completing missions and protecting your mates. The NVA soldiers we fought were not evil. They were soldiers fighting for their side, just like we were fighting for ours. The difference was tactical, not moral. We were better at small unit operations in jungle terrain. They adapted by trying to avoid us. That is what professionals." The legacy of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam extended far beyond the war itself. Military forces around the world studied their tactics. The combination of small patrol size, stealth, precision targeting, and immediate fire support coordination became a model for special operations doctrine. The psychological impact of tactical excellence, the way reputation itself became a weapon, influenced thinking about unconventional warfare. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the captured documents themselves. The standing orders issued by the North Vietnamese Army to avoid engaging Australian forces represented institutional acknowledgement of tactical dominance. In military history, such explicit admissions are rare. They provide insight into how professional military forces assess threats and adapt doctrine. Those documents confirmed what Australian veterans had long suspected. They had not just fought well, they had fought so well that the enemy changed how it operated specifically to avoid them. In a war where strategic victory proved elusive, that tactical achievement stood as testament to training, discipline, and professional excellence. Morrison, in his final interview before he passed away in 2015, was asked what he wanted people to understand about Australian SAS operations in Vietnam. His answer was characteristically measured. We were not supermen. We were well-trained soldiers doing a difficult job in terrible conditions. We succeeded because we worked as teams, because we planned carefully, and because we executed with discipline. The NVA learned to avoid us not because we were invincible, but because we made fighting us too costly to be worthwhile. That is the essence of successful tactic. You force the enemy to make choices that benefit your objectives. In our case, by making them avoid us, we reduced their operational effectiveness without having to kill all of them. It was efficient, it was professional, and it worked. He paused, looking out the window at the peaceful Australian landscape. But I also want people to understand that war is not glorious. It is necessary sometimes, or at least people decide it is, but it is never glorious. We did our duty, we protected our mates, we came home. That is enough. The enemy's fear was not a badge of honor. It was simply evidence that we did our job well. Nothing more, nothing less. The sun sets over Phuoc Tuy province in modern Vietnam. The rubber plantations are still there, now managed by Vietnamese companies rather than French colonials. The jungle trails where Morrison and Chen once hunted are now overgrown or paved as roads. The war is history, remembered differently depending on which side you ask. But in military academies in Australia, in staff colleges studying unconventional warfare, and in memoirs written by Vietnamese veterans, the story persists. The story of how a few hundred Australian soldiers created such tactical dominance that their enemies, professional soldiers themselves, decided the smart play was not to fight. It was the ultimate compliment, the recognition that some opponents are too skilled, too dangerous, too professional to engage without overwhelming advantage. This was not Hollywood heroism. This was not dramatic last stands or suicidal charges. This was professional military excellence creating tangible operational results through training, discipline, and tactical innovation. The North Vietnamese Army made a calculated decision that fighting Australian SAS was not worth the casualty. They issued orders in writing. They trained their soldiers accordingly. And they survived to win the larger war by avoiding battles they would likely lose. In that calculation, there was no shame. There was recognition. There was respect between professionals. There was the understanding that war is not about pride, but about objectives. And sometimes, the smartest tactical decision is to let the dangerous enemy walk away and live to fight where you have advantage. That is the real story of Australian SAS in Vietnam. Not a story of invincibility, but of competence so pronounced that it changed enemy doctrine. Not a story of winning the war, but of tactical dominance within operational boundaries. Not a story of good versus evil, but of professionals on both sides, making the best decisions they could with the information available. The ghosts walked the jungle for 6 years. Then they went home. But their reputation, encoded in enemy documents and remembered in military history, outlasted the war itself. That is legacy enough. If you found this story fascinating, please subscribe to our channel for more untold military history. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on tactical innovation in unconventional warfare, and hit the like button if you appreciate deep dives into the professional realities of combat that go beyond Hollywood myths. Until next time, remember that history is written not just by victors, but by professionals on all sides who documented their experiences. We just have to be willing to read what they wrote.